fearful time. Since 9/11, people have become more afraid than before because of terrorism. Charles Stanley.
9/11 brought what has always been a very scary issue to the forefront of our reality. Since 2001, there have been tens of thousands of deaths related to terrorist activity. Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah are two of hundreds of terrorist groups. That's purpose is only to kill.
Terrorism puts us all at risk. Terrorist groups specialize in mass murder. They don't try to kill individuals. They set out to kill as many as quickly as possible. During 9/11 alone, over 3,000 innocent men, women, and children lost their lives to an unspeakable horror.
Within our organization is to gain funding for the neutralization and extermination of terrorist threats. We believe that terrorist activity is the number one threat to the safety of this world and must be ended once and for all using the funding being allocated to the creatively named NGO.
Why has the Middle East become such a hotbed of terrorism? The majority of nations in the Middle Eastern region are Islamic, so they follow the Quran. People interpret the Quran in such a way that terrorism is in fact the answer. Governments, such as the Iranian, actually provide funds for certain terrorist organizations. However, there is one prominent country in the Middle East that is not Islamic: Israel. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Israel, being the sole Jewish nation in the region, always harbors a lot of terrorist activity. Double-digit terrorist attacks have been recorded on Israeli soil annually from the start of the new millennia, including well over 100 attacks each year from 2000 to 2002. The age-old problem is defining what is a terrorism and what classifies as terrorist activity. Israel contains one of the world's largest armies, and they're not afraid to use it. Their solution to terrorism is more violence, war, and killing.
Go.
Solving killing with killing is not a very ideal tactic, and seeing as it only resorts in more death, it's not a very successful one either. The U.S. used 9/11 and terrorism as an excuse to invade Iraq in 2003. That didn't turn out to be very effective either. However, the U.S. has implemented effective counterterrorism strategies since 9/11, including the founding of the NCTC, the National Counterterrorism Center. The NCTC, FBI, CIA are all government organizations. They'd be considered the brains of the counterterrorism movement. Since the inception of the NCTC in 2004, terrorist activity has reduced drastically. They act not only as a deterrent to any terrorist, international or domestic, they have in fact assassinated several high-ranking members of terrorist groups.
Go.
Rooted in poverty and the masses of the continent that hosts over 3.5 billion people, terrorism in the Far East sprouts up nearly everywhere the world is developing in this region. Their motives are the same as terrorists worldwide. They seek to alleviate themselves from what they see as social or political injustice. However, they gain permission from their superiors to do this by any means possible. In poor countries, anger against those higher powers or those with more money is not uncommon. Religious leaders in these regions will educate anyone who is willing to use violence and brainwash young children into doing their bidding. The near vicinity to the Taliban and Al-Qaeda branches in Pakistan and India brings violence into the region in general. Anyone who would support violence to assert their power against the state may become a member of a mujahideen, which in translation means someone troubled in the ways of Allah, a jihad militant group, which is a radical sect of Islam, or a Jamaat associate. Some of the common terrorists associated with Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, are the Indian Mujahideen, the Turkestan Independence Movement, the Abu Sayyaf group, and the Jamaat Islamiyah. These groups coordinate and share supply lines and strike randomly throughout Asia at any given time. They'll put innocent people to death by any means, but usually a public attack in a large populated area would be the hope. Terrorist groups performing these tasks believe themselves to be righteous in fighting for freedom or political rights. They seek to promote their religion and all the things associated with it. However, the governments share a very different view of this. The Indian government, for example, treats terrorism with the utmost respect. There's a large problem there and kills about 1,000 people annually. Due to the Indians' lack of capital, they don't have the funds to support anti-terrorist programs or militias used to counter terrorist activity. The Sri Lankans had to fight a war for 10 years with terrorism on the Elam Tigers, who bomb their capital city daily and use kamikaze attacks to destroy their industry. The Chinese need to constantly fight the East Turkestan independence movement, who wish to liberate the province of Xizang, where militants attack the Communist Party and attempt to take over the territory by killing several officials or police officers every year. While there are primitive organizations put in place to combat terrorist funding by money laundering, these organizations do not have enough firepower, money, or political power to help everyone. In fact, President Bush called Far East Asia America's second front in the war on terrorism started after 9/11. Countries without capital or materials to counter these terrorists in East Asia are in great number. To help maintain a stable government that can fend off its own enemies and make life less stressful and dangerous for their citizens, we need to group together and work against terrorists. The Indian, Indonesian, Malaysian, Chinese, Thailandese, and Sri Lankan governments all suffer from terrorism in some way. We need your help to make them stable. Fellow NGO members, help your brother men. Let them be safe from radicals and fanatics that wish to harm them in the world's largest continent.
In the past year, there have been 705 suspected terrorists arrested in Europe in 15 different nations. France, Spain, and the United Kingdom are the countries most severely affected by terrorism in Europe. About 1,000 attacks have been carried out in the past few years. 90% of international terrorist attacks in Europe are motivated by anti-governmental sentiment. Most of these attacks are unorganized and only carried out by one person, but a few are carried out by organized civilian groups or even organized terrorists. Some of the terrorist organizations known to be based in Europe include the Irish Republican Army, or the IRA, the Al-Qaeda European Sector, Hezbollah, and English or Irish Republican splinter cells. The major difference between violence in Europe and the other sections of the world is that attacks in Europe are often less organized than those in the other regions. An example of these would be when there were anti-governmental attacks against the authorities in Europe, nowadays often targeted towards those who have strong opinions about the conflict in Syria. Also, those in Europe more often have access to the internet, which studies have shown can contribute to a single-man terrorist motivation because of the websites that tell how to make makeshift weapons and bombs. The motivation for terrorist strikes in Europe vary widely, but almost all are targeted at the government. Recently, there has been an increase of attacks that are associated with the conflicts in Europe is involved in abroad, such as Syria and Iran. Maybe the most controversial of these groups is Hezbollah. Hezbollah, while being a Lebanese group, has carried out attacks against European minority groups and raises funding in European countries. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is currently debating whether or not to define them as an official terrorist organization due to the opinion of some that it should be defined as a hostile political party as opposed to a terrorist cell. In 2012, the terrorism has claimed the lives of 17 Europeans over a span of 412 attacks and 512 terrorist-related arrests. Several of these deaths occurred in one attack by a spontaneous, unorganized shooter motivated by the Muslim religion. All in all, terrorists are bad. It does not matter who you work for, what you do to achieve your goals, or how strong your motivation is, or how people may sympathize with you. The killing of innocent civilians is wrong by every moral code ever conceived. Now, for a special ending segment for our director of Pizzazz, Right. And now from our director of Pizzazz, Bryce Holden.
What can you do to help? Unfortunately, as of now, there's not much you can do. All you can do, really, is put your trust and put your faith in your government and your politicians. As always, with all issues, it's never a bad idea to advocate your opinion at local gatherings or powwows. Thanks.
While terror affects the world on all levels, it is important to know that there's always somewhere you can turn to. Many organizations worldwide offer websites, forms of communication that you can reach them by. You can report acts of terrorism or suspicion to these websites, and they may respond. However, the most important thing to do is to get funding from NGO. These organizations will become much more powerful. Governments worldwide will become much more powerful in dealing with all of these issues. Terrorism will be less of an issue with your help. So, fellow NGO members, stand up and help your fellow man. Help the world be safe from terrorism and live peaceful lives.